The late afternoon sun blazed over the dusty plains of Montana, casting long shadows across the weathered fence posts and worn leather saddles. At the center of the corral, a towering black stallion reared up, thrashing against the reins with a fury that made the earth tremble beneath the boots of the watching ranch hands. His name was Shadow, a beast feared and respected, untamed for years. Every man who had tried to get close walked away broken, if they walked away at all. But now, with a deep and deliberate voice, Walter Langston, the aging ranch owner in his signature tan vest and crisp white shirt, stepped forward and said the words that would silence the crowd. "Touch that horse, and the ranch is yours." Ethan Whitaker, a rugged man in his early 40s with sandy blonde hair and a soldier's posture, stood just feet away from the snorting stallion. His hand gripped the lead rope tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He wasn't a local, just a drifter looking for honest work. But something about Shadow had drawn him in, a connection he couldn't explain. Around the corral, ranch hands exchanged wary glances. No one had ever heard Walter make an offer like that, not in decades of working the Langston ranch. Walter's weathered face showed little emotion, but his eyes held something deeper, a buried sorrow, a challenge, maybe even guilt. Behind him, Grace Holloway, the ranch's veterinarian, stood quietly observing. She had seen Shadow lash out before, but there was something different now. Something about Ethan had changed the stallion's stance. Shadow wasn't backing down, but he wasn't attacking either. It was as if he recognized something, or someone. Ethan stepped slowly forward, boots crunching the dry earth beneath him. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch when the horse pawed the ground. He just looked into the animal's eyes, wide, wild, but deeply aware. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Every man around the corral watched with bated breath. And Walter Langston, silent and still, seemed to brace for something, though no one knew what. Then Ethan whispered, "Easy now," and stretched out his hand. Shadow didn't move. His ears twitched, muscles tense, but he didn't bolt. Inches away from the horse's neck, Ethan stopped. Not out of fear, but recognition. A memory, long buried, flickered behind his eyes. A woman's voice. The smell of fresh hay. A black horse just like this one. But that wasn't possible. Was it? Just as Ethan's fingertips were about to make contact, Shadow suddenly reared again, letting out a furious scream that echoed across the valley. Men scrambled backward. Dust flew. But Walter didn't move. His jaw clenched, and his eyes locked on Ethan's hand. There was something more going on here, something none of them understood yet. But whatever it was, it had just been awakened. The following morning brought a heavy fog that rolled low over the valley, softening the edges of the old Langston ranch. Ethan Whitaker stood near the corral fence, sipping bitter black coffee from a tin mug as Shadow grazed alone in the corner of the enclosure. The horse's wild behavior from the day before still pulsed in Ethan's mind like a drumbeat he couldn't ignore. He didn't know what came over him when he stepped toward that animal. It wasn't courage. It was something else. Something deeper. Like he'd seen those eyes before, long before yesterday. Grace Holloway approached, a leather satchel slung over her shoulder and her brown hair tucked under a worn hat. She'd spent the night replaying what she saw. Shadow wasn't just reacting. He was responding. "He didn't rear until you almost touched him," she said softly, joining Ethan at the fence. "That's not nothing." Her voice held both curiosity and concern. Ethan nodded but said nothing. He hadn't slept. A dream had visited him during the night, not violent, just strange. A woman's voice, a warm barn, the scent of cedarwood, and that same horse, or one just like it. Inside the ranch house, Walter Langston sat alone in the study, staring at a weathered photograph clutched in his hands. The frame was cracked, the image faded, a young woman smiling beside a black stallion. He ran his thumb over her face. Helen. Her name was rarely spoken on the ranch anymore, but her presence haunted every inch of it. She had vanished over 20 years ago. No one had ever truly figured out what happened. But now, looking out his window at Ethan, Walter's gut told him the past had come back. In flesh and blood. Back in the stables, Ethan wandered into the storage room, needing space to clear his head. Rows of old tack and rusted bits lined the walls. A small cedar chest in the corner caught his eye, not because of its appearance, but because of the initials carved into the lid, H.W. Hesitantly, he opened it. Inside were letters, ribbons, and a photograph. The same one Walter held in the house. Ethan picked it up and froze. There she was, the woman from his dreams. She stood beside a black horse, hand resting gently on its mane. And she was wearing a necklace. The same one his foster mother had given him as a child, saying it was the only thing found with him as a baby. His heart pounded. He stumbled back, the photograph still in hand. "Who was she?" he whispered. Grace, who had quietly followed him, appeared behind him in the doorway. Her face paled as she looked at the image. "That's Helen Winters," she said. "She worked here. She disappeared just before you were born." Ethan's mouth went dry. There was no way this was a coincidence. Everything he thought he knew about his past was beginning to unravel. Outside, Shadow let out a low, mournful whinny, not angry, not wild. It was a sound of recognition, a call from the past. And somehow, Ethan knew, the horse remembered her too. The days had grown colder since Ethan Whitaker arrived, but the air around the ranch felt heavier for other reasons. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected. The horse, the photograph, the necklace he wore his entire life. Something deep inside told him this wasn't chance. As he sat on the porch of the bunkhouse that evening, the wind stirred the dust across the yard, whispering through the dry grass like distant voices trying to be heard. He stared at the necklace in his hand, a simple silver pendant in the shape of a feather, and wondered what kind of woman would leave her child behind with only this as a trace. Inside the main house, Walter Langston stood before the large stone fireplace, nursing a glass of aged bourbon. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from memory. He hadn't looked at those old photos in years. Not since Helen disappeared. He had convinced himself she ran off, maybe scared, maybe ashamed. But now Ethan's face was too familiar, his presence too disturbing. Walter had spent decades burying the past, building his empire on silence. But one look at that boy, and all of it threatened to come undone. Meanwhile, Grace Holloway found herself digging through the ranch's old veterinary files, long since untouched. She wasn't just looking for health records on Shadow, she was looking for dates. Something didn't add up. Helen Winters had vanished 24 years ago. Ethan had told her he was about to turn 24 next month. And Shadow? He'd been born the very year Helen disappeared. Shadow wasn't just a horse. He was the last living witness to whatever happened back then. Grace didn't believe in fate, but this was starting to look like it had been written long ago. Ethan finally worked up the nerve to confront Walter the next morning. He walked into the house without knocking, still holding the photograph of Helen. Walter looked up from his leather chair, his jaw tight, eyes unreadable. Ethan placed the picture gently on the coffee table between them. "I think I deserve to know," he said firmly. "Who was she to you?" Walter didn't respond immediately. His silence was not hesitation, it was exhaustion. Finally, he leaned forward, fingers steepled, and said, "She was everything. But the truth doesn't change what was lost." There was no anger in Ethan's voice when he replied, only confusion. "Was she my mother?" Walter's eyes didn't leave the photo. "That horse out there? Shadow. She raised him. He followed her like a dog. And when she vanished, he stopped letting anyone near him. He looked up at Ethan now, something fragile behind the old man's usual sternness. "You have her eyes. Her quiet way." Ethan could feel the earth shifting beneath him. His entire life had been a mystery, and now, piece by piece, it was being rewritten. Outside, Shadow stood at the edge of the corral, staring directly at the house. Ears forward, still, watching, waiting, as if he knew a storm long buried was finally rising again. Later that day, Grace Holloway returned to the cedar chest in the tack room, the same one where Ethan had found the photo. She had a hunch there was more. Carefully, she removed a stack of old grooming brushes and a moth-eaten blanket, revealing a false bottom in the chest. Her breath caught when she lifted the panel and found a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with twine. The top one was addressed in delicate handwriting, "To my son, if he ever finds this." Her hands trembled as she read the name on the corner, Helen Whitaker. She knew right away Ethan needed to see this. When Ethan opened the letter hours later, his world shifted again. The handwriting was shaky but full of warmth. Helen spoke of love, regret, and fear. She wrote about being young, alone, and pregnant, and how she trusted Walter Langston more than anyone. But something happened. She hinted at secrets she couldn't name, something that made her afraid for her life, and for her unborn child's. Her last lines struck like thunder. "If you're reading this, it means you found your way back. I never stopped loving you. And I never wanted to leave you." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes before he could finish. He walked outside, letter in hand, needing air, needing space. Shadow stood at the far edge of the pasture, calm now, watching him like always. But this time, Ethan didn't see just a horse. He saw a connection to the mother he never knew, a witness to the pain she left behind. Slowly, without speaking, he crossed the field. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached Shadow, he stopped just inches away, unsure if the stallion would bolt or fight. But the horse didn't move. He lowered his head slightly, not in fear, but almost in recognition. Walter, watching from the porch, gripped the railing tightly. He had read the letter too. It was one Helen had begged him to destroy years ago, but he never could. And now, here it was, reopening wounds he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. Ethan wasn't just some drifter. He was the son of the only woman Walter had ever truly loved. And Walter had failed her. He failed them both. But worse than that, he knew more than he had ever admitted to anyone. Grace joined Walter on the porch, her voice low. "You knew where she was going that night, didn't you?" Walter didn't respond at first. Then, with a cracked voice, he muttered, "She wasn't just scared of the world. She was scared of someone here." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Grace realized this wasn't just a story of a mother and child torn apart. There was something darker at the heart of it, something hidden deep inside the soil of the ranch itself. And just as Ethan reached out and gently touched Shadow's muzzle, for the first time, without resistance, thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming, but not just in the sky. That night, the storm finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows of the bunkhouse, and thunder rolled endlessly across the valley like a warning that had waited years to be heard. Ethan sat alone at the table, the letter from Helen spread before him, now creased and smudged with fingerprints. He couldn't stop reading it, not because he didn't understand it, but because a part of him still couldn't believe it. His entire life, he'd wondered where he came from, who he belonged to. And now, he wasn't sure if the answers gave him peace or only deeper questions. Out near the edge of the property, a rusted iron gate marked the border between Langston Ranch and the neighboring land owned by Roy Abernathy, a longtime rival of Walter Langston. Roy was the kind of man who smiled through his teeth and shook hands like he was choking your wrist. 4 years, he'd been trying to buy up the Langston property, and for years, Walter had refused. But now that Ethan was here, and the truth about Helen was resurfacing, Roy had returned with new interest. His timing wasn't just convenient, it was intentional. Grace had her suspicions. She remembered something Helen once told her years ago, during a quiet moment in the stables. "There are men who wear kindness like a coat," Helen had whispered. "But when they think no one's looking, they take it off." At the time, Grace didn't know what Helen meant. Now, those words echoed louder than ever. Roy Abernathy had always lingered too long around the ranch, asking too many questions. And Helen's fear hadn't been vague, it had been specific. Directed. What if Roy had something to do with her disappearance? The next morning, Ethan rode out past the main barn and stopped at the iron gate. Shadow walked beside him, calm and focused, no longer the wild creature from before. There was a strange comfort in the horse's presence now, like they shared something unspoken. Ethan dismounted and stepped closer to the gate. That land beyond used to be part of the Langston ranch decades ago, before Walter sold it off. Ethan's eyes scanned the field, empty except for an old, abandoned shed in the distance. But something in his gut told him the truth might be hiding right there in plain sight. When Ethan returned to the house, Walter was already waiting. He sat in the parlor with a map spread across the table and a bottle of bourbon half empty. His eyes were red, but not from drink. "There's something you need to see," he said quietly. The map showed the boundaries of the ranch, current and former. Walter pointed to a marked area deep in the woods, near an old river crossing. "That's where Helen said she was going the night she disappeared," he muttered. "She was planning to meet someone." Ethan didn't have to ask who. The name was already circling in his head like a hawk, Roy Abernathy. And suddenly, it all made sense. The fear. The silence. The way Walter always avoided talking about that night. The answers weren't just buried in the past, they were buried on this land. The woods beyond the river were quiet, too quiet. Ethan Whitaker guided Shadow along the overgrown trail, the morning light struggling to pierce through the dense pines. The air smelled of wet earth and moss, thick with the kind of stillness that only exists where time has stood still. He had studied the map Walter gave him, marked with a red X near the edge of the property where Helen had planned to meet someone all those years ago. Ethan's instincts told him that whatever happened to her, it started right here. He dismounted near a fallen tree and tied Shadow loosely to a branch, patting the horse gently before moving ahead on foot. The forest floor was soft and damp beneath his boots. As he moved through the trees, he spotted a structure hidden beneath decades of growth, a small wooden shed, collapsed in on itself but still standing enough to be recognized. Vines snaked up the sides, and the door hung crooked, barely attached to its hinges. Ethan hesitated for a moment before reaching for the rusted handle. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and rot. Broken crates and rusted tools were scattered across the dirt floor, but one thing stood out immediately: a metal lockbox, half buried beneath an old saddle blanket. Ethan pulled it free and sat back on his heels, heart pounding. The initials on the box were clear: H.W. He forced it open with a nearby rock, and inside were folded documents, a small journal, and something that stopped his breath cold, a gold locket with a photo inside. On one side, Helen smiled softly. On the other, a baby, him. Ethan sat there, staring at the photo, the weight of it all finally settling in his chest. His mother had planned to run. She had packed important things. She knew she was in danger. And she never made it out of those woods. The journal's final pages, written in hurried, shaky handwriting, detailed a growing fear of a man who wouldn't let go. Though she never named him directly, the description was clear: Roy Abernathy. He had pursued her, even after she made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. Walter may have suspected, but Helen knew. Back at the ranch, Grace Holloway paced nervously outside the barn, watching the trail that led to the woods. Walter hadn't said much since Ethan left that morning, only that some ghosts don't stay buried. She knew Walter blamed himself, but deep down, she also believed he'd been protecting Ethan by keeping the truth hidden all these years. Still, secrets had a way of bleeding into the soil, and now the truth was coming up with the roots. As Ethan emerged from the trees, carrying the lockbox, Shadow raised his head and let out a sharp snort, ears pricked. Ethan didn't say a word. He mounted and rode hard back to the ranch, dust trailing behind him like smoke. He had proof now. Pieces of Helen's final hours. And he knew exactly who needed to see it first. The sky burned orange as the sun sank behind the hills, casting long shadows across the Langston ranch. Ethan rode through the front gates with dust in his wake and purpose in his eyes. Tucked inside his saddlebag was Helen's journal, the photo locket, and the documents from the lockbox. Proof that she hadn't run away, proof that she had planned to escape from someone. And Ethan was done chasing shadows. It was time to face the man whose name had haunted every page of her final days, Roy Abernathy. Walter Langston was already waiting on the porch when Ethan dismounted. He didn't ask any questions. He just looked at the lockbox in Ethan's hand and knew. "It's him, isn't it?" Walter said quietly, almost like he was admitting something to himself. Ethan nodded. "It was always him." Walter looked away, jaw tight. "I should have done something back then. I knew he had an eye for her. I just didn't know how far he was willing to go." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. And it was about to be broken. Ethan didn't wait for morning. He saddled up Shadow again, this time not as a mystery, but as a partner. He rode out under the fading daylight toward the Abernathy Ranch, a stretch of fenced land and steel buildings that sat like scars across the countryside. As he approached the front gate, Roy stood near the fence line, sipping whiskey from a tin cup as if he'd been expecting him. "Evening," Roy said casually, his smile tight and cold. "Word travels fast out here." Ethan dismounted but didn't return the pleasantry. He pulled Helen's journal from his coat and held it up. "I know what you did," Ethan said, his voice steady. "And I know why she never came back." Roy's smile faded. For the first time, there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. But Ethan didn't back down. "She wrote about you. The things you said. The things you did. She was afraid of you. She tried to get away, and you made sure she didn't." He tossed the journal onto the dirt at Roy's feet. "You can deny it all you want, but her words speak louder than yours ever will." Roy stepped forward, fists clenched, but Shadow let out a deep warning snort that made the older man hesitate. "That horse remembers her," Ethan said. "And I think he remembers you too." The tension hung between them like a drawn rope, neither man moving. But the truth was no longer buried. It was exposed, raw, undeniable, and echoing through the very land they stood on. Roy didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked back toward his house, but Ethan knew this wasn't over. As he rode back under the moonlight, Ethan felt the weight of justice finally begin to settle. He didn't have a courtroom. He didn't need one. He had Helen's voice, her words, and a past that refused to stay silent. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't just a man searching for the truth. He was the one carrying it forward. The next morning brought a chill that settled deep in Ethan's bones, even as the sun rose clean and bright over the ranch. But he wasn't interested in the weather. He was focused on making the truth permanent. What he had found in the woods couldn't stay just between him, Grace, and Walter. It had to be documented. Preserved. He sat at the long wooden table in the barn office, the journal open beside him, and began recording a statement on an old tape recorder Grace had pulled from storage. His voice was calm but firm. Every word he spoke gave weight to his mother's memory. "I'm Ethan Whitaker. Helen Whitaker was my mother," he began. "She disappeared 24 years ago, and now I know she didn't just vanish. She was running from Roy Abernathy." He paused, looking out the window toward the fence line in the distance. "She tried to protect me before I was even born, and now I'm going to protect her name." He ended the tape by placing the photo of Helen and the locket on the table. "This is for the record. The truth matters, even if it's been buried a long time." Grace stepped in quietly after he finished, her eyes misty. "You did right," she said. "There are too many stories like hers that never get told." She picked up the tape recorder and handed it to him. "Let this be the first time someone listens." Ethan gave her a nod, grateful. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't closure, not yet. Roy Abernathy hadn't confessed. The law had nothing to act on but the journal, and Walter's silent regrets weren't going to be enough to bring Roy to justice. Meanwhile, Walter stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Shadow graze peacefully. The stallion had changed since Ethan's arrival. Calmer, more present. It was as if he'd finally found someone who spoke his silent language. Walter exhaled slowly, hands in his coat pockets. "She would have been proud of you," he said quietly as Ethan approached. "I wasn't strong enough back then. I let fear keep me from helping her." Ethan didn't respond right away. He simply stood beside the older man, both of them facing the horizon. "But you helped now," Ethan finally said. "It's not too late to make it right." That afternoon, Walter made a rare visit into town, not for business, but for the sheriff. He walked into the office and placed the lockbox, the journal, and Ethan's recording on the desk. "There's something you need to look into," he said firmly. Sheriff Dale Harwood, an old friend of Walter's, didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and began reviewing the contents. There were names in that journal, dates, descriptions, enough to start asking the right questions, and maybe, finally, to hold Roy accountable. Back at the ranch, Ethan walked through the barn one last time before sunset, brushing his hand along the old beams and breathing in the scent of leather, hay, and thyme. Every creak in the wood felt like a whisper from the past. He stopped at Shadow's stall, meeting the horse's gaze again. This time, there was no tension, only understanding. The past had spoken. Now came the reckoning. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by the next morning, the whispers had already reached every corner of the valley. Roy Abernathy's name was being spoken in ways it never had before, not with respect, but with suspicion. Sheriff Dale Harwood had quietly launched an investigation after reviewing Helen's journal and Ethan's statement. Old employees, neighbors, and even family members were being asked questions that no one had dared speak out loud in over 2 decades. For the first time, the silence surrounding Helen Whitaker's disappearance was beginning to crack. Roy, however, wasn't a man who took kindly to being cornered. He stormed into the sheriff's office later that day, red-faced and seething. "This is slander," he growled, slamming his fist on the desk. "You're going to take the word of some drifter and a horse?" Sheriff Harwood didn't flinch. "I'm taking the word of a woman who feared for her life, and a trail of evidence that points straight to you." Roy sneered, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes now. The confidence he once wore like armor was beginning to crack. Back at the ranch, Ethan walked the property alone, his thoughts as heavy as the clouds rolling in from the west. Though he had done what he set out to do, uncover the truth, he didn't feel peace. Not yet. He stopped at the old cedar tree near the edge of the pasture, the same one his mother used to sit beneath with Shadow when the horse was still young. Grace had told him stories about those quiet moments, and now he stood there, imagining Helen's voice, her laugh, her fear. "I'm here now," he whispered, placing a hand on the bark. "You're not forgotten." Walter joined him there a few moments later, walking slowly but with a steady determination. "The sheriff's building a case," he said. "It won't be easy. Too much time has passed. Too many people turned away when it mattered." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "But it's something," he said. Walter looked at him, pride flickering in his tired eyes. "You did what I never had the courage to do." For the first time since Ethan arrived, the weight between them began to lift, not entirely, but enough for both men to breathe. That evening, a group of neighbors and former ranch hands gathered at Langston Ranch. Some came to offer support, others to share memories of Helen, stories they'd kept to themselves for years. One man, an old farrier named Jed, revealed that he saw Helen the night she vanished, walking toward the old trail near the river, looking over her shoulder. "I thought she was just heading home," he said quietly. "But something about the way she walked, she was scared." His voice cracked with regret. "I should have said something." As the fire pit glowed and the stars appeared overhead, Ethan stood beside Shadow's paddock, watching the flames flicker. The night was quiet, but not empty. He felt her presence in the wind, in the earth, in the eyes of the horse that had once been her only companion. The truth had taken root. And now, all that remained was for justice to catch up. 2 weeks later, the wind carried a different sound through the Montana Valley, the low rumble of engines and the sharp clap of boots on gravel. Roy Abernathy was arrested just after dawn. The sheriff had gathered enough witness accounts, documentation, and pieces of Helen's journal to issue a warrant. Roy didn't resist. He stood on his porch, expression hollow, as handcuffs clicked over his wrists. For a man who once controlled so much with fear and influence, he looked small now, like a ghost finally caught by the daylight. Word spread fast, but this time, no one defended him. No one stood in his corner. Back at Langston Ranch, Ethan watched the clouds roll over the hills from the same porch where he'd first met Walter. The weight he carried felt lighter, not because everything was healed, but because the truth had finally been seen. Beside him, Grace handed him a folded letter, something she'd found tucked into the back of Helen's journal. It was addressed simply, "To my son, for the day you learn the truth." Ethan opened it slowly, fingers trembling. Helen's words were filled with hope, not fear. She wrote about the kind of man she dreamed he'd become. Strong, but gentle. Brave enough to search for the truth, and kind enough to carry it with grace. Ethan read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it into his pocket. "She never stopped believing in me," he whispered. Grace nodded, her eyes glassy. "And now the whole world knows who she really was." In that moment, the ranch didn't feel like just a place anymore. It felt like a home. Not just for Ethan, but for the memory of a woman whose life had been stolen too soon. A place where her story would be remembered, not buried. Walter joined them outside, walking slowly, shoulders more relaxed than they had been in years. "I updated the deed," he said, handing Ethan an envelope. "Langston Ranch belongs to you now. It's where it should have been all along." Ethan stared at him, unsure of what to say. "Why now?" Walter looked out at the pasture, where Shadow grazed peacefully. "Because I spent too many years running from what I should have faced. You came here with questions, but you gave me something back, a second chance to do right." Later that evening, Ethan stood by the fence, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of amber and gold. Shadow stood beside him, calm and steady, the way he'd always been with Helen. Ethan reached out, resting a hand gently on the stallion's neck. "We made it, boy," he said softly. "She's finally at peace." In that quiet, the horse nudged him gently, almost like an answer. And as night settled over the land, the old wounds began to close, not erased, but healed in truth. Ethan had come to the ranch as a stranger. Now, he stayed as a son, a protector, and the keeper of a legacy that would never be forgotten.